I look at every person who subscribes to the channel as being part of a community. Not only is my channel a community, but it's a community associated with a much larger community. And there's a certain social obligation that I feel that when you put a channel up, that has to be recognized. And when we find something, particularly myself, that I feel impacts the community, I feel I have an obligation to share that with you. I recently read an article that disturbed me and did not realize probably what is happening in certain circles, and we'll get into that. I think it's important that each of you, myself included in this, always keep a balance, always question, and keep a healthy perspective. When we're dealing in subject matter, well, like mine, I deal in a lot of deep topics. They're not necessarily associated with any particular genre other than probably more of a philosopher's heart. But I also deal with subject matter that can be at times controversial, at times disturbing. And I see us working together. No one has all the answers. No one has the complete book. Wish we did. But working together on issues, topics, together as a community, we can find solutions. I'm going to bring to your attention that probably many of you are not aware of, but you will be after this. It has now become medically documented that Nibiru is a disease. You're going to read an article that I'm going to show you that's going to point this out. In stage 1, it's considered to be Nibiru awareness. That is where a person happens to hear about it and the seed is planted. The infection starts. The hypnosis begins. Stage 2 is Nibiru addiction. That's when it becomes where a person begins to actively seek out discussion groups, Facebook, YouTube, etc. Stage 3 is now classified as Nibiru psychosis, and that is now classified as a psychosis. That is an individual who's making preparations for the end of the earth. Now, it's important to remember stages 2 and 3 require medication and thousands of hours of intense therapy. Yeah. All right, so we're going to go to the story now, and you're going to see this for yourself. I will leave a link. So this article, as you can see, is on someonebones.com. It's a blog. This is an article, and I am going to leave the link. Harvard Psychiatrist, Nibiru Addiction, a True Disease. Nibiru addiction is a growing psychological illness, says Dr. Patricia Wallace, a Harvard-educated psychiatrist with over 30 years of clinical experience. She became aware of this illness, she says, when patients began creating elaborate fantasies about a distant celestial object on a collision course with planet Earth. I first learned about Nibiru from a patient back in 2012, Dr. Wallace said. He was absolutely convinced that a mythical planet was going to smash into Earth in December of that year. I desperately tried to work with him, but the fantasy completely consumed him. I thought, of course, this was an isolated incident until I met another patient several months later who also believed in Nibiru. In 2013, Dr. Wallace started researching the psychological impact Nibiru had on patients. She began clinical studies, opening her doors to patients whose visions of Nibiru had affected their lives. However, since Nibiru believers do not believe they are psychologically impaired, Dr. Wallace had to entice them into her office for counseling. She offered incentives, $150 to each patient willing to communicate his Nibiru experiences. Unfortunately, patients flooded her office, and she soon realized that the majority of the new patients merely sought some of the free cash and did not believe in Nibiru at all. To her credit, Dr. Wallace had done sufficient research to weed out the phonies. It was a tough chore, Dr. Wallace confessed, but I was still shocked at how many people actually believed in the Nibiru hypothesis. Staggering, truly staggering. The ones I talked to really didn't want help. They simply wanted to tell me their Nibiru stories. They were more interested in convincing me about Nibiru realities than in acknowledging their own problems. In 1 year, I saw 50 Nibiru patients. Some of these people need thousands of hours of therapy. Dr. Wallace believes these patients suffer from a debilitating condition, a diagnosable ailment she calls Nibiru addiction. The disease, she said, manifests in 3 stages. The first stage is Nibiru awareness. This typically occurs when a susceptible person is exposed to the word Nibiru or Planet X. Hypnosis, folks. I'm hypnotizing you now. Often through word of mouth or read on internet conspiracy forums. During this stage, the individual is still fully functional member of society. In the back of his mind, though, he is constantly thinking about Planet X and how it will destroy the Earth. He doesn't speak of this openly or publicly, but may communicate anonymously with other believers. Holy crap. Over time, Nibiru awareness may escalate to the second stage, Nibiru addiction, a deeper pathology that seizes the patient's psyche with overwhelming thoughts and visions of Nibiru. At this point, Dr. Wallace says, patients often exhibit uncharacteristic behavior such as nonviolent verbal outbursts against anyone challenging their beliefs in the Nibiru system. Nibiru becomes their psychological anchor. Nibiru addiction should not be taken lightly. Patients start to suffer disassociation, wholeheartedly consumed with exploring the Nibiru myths. They may spend hours upon hours prowling internet forums, believing they are conducting Nibiru research to the betterment of humanity. They present compelling arguments with absolutely no evidence. The disease must be arrested here. Without medication and intense therapy, the condition may worsen. In rare cases, Nibiru addiction escalates to Nibiru psychosis, by which point the patient has lost touch with reality. Although seldom physically violent, patients suffering from Nibiru psychosis tend to elevate their sense of self-importance. They perceive themselves as Nibiru messiahs, part of a savior movement dedicated to warning the world about an impending Nibiru apocalypse that will eradicate all life on Earth. Some are truly convincing, Dr. Wallace said. They may start websites or YouTube channels and rally other Nibiru believers to their cause. Unfortunately, they lost touch with friends and family, burned bridges, lost their jobs, and sometimes worse. For example, I had one patient who suffered a terrible case of Nibiru psychosis. I'll call him Doug. He became so convinced that Nibiru was going to ravage the earth that he took his family savings and spent it on cat food. Okay, that's right, cat food. He wanted his 17 cats to survive the Nibiru apocalypse. He spent $4,500 on cat food. Then, after he started getting substantial amounts of donations from fellow Nibiru believers, he took that money and abandoned his wife, his children, and his cats. Sad, very sad. I wish I could have helped him more. Wow. Following that incident, Dr. Wallace petitioned the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, to recognize Nibiru addiction as a potentially pandemic disease. Now, if you don't know what a pandemic is, I'll just tell you very quickly. When you have mass outbreaks, let's say, of influenza, and it gets to a point of a population, that becomes a pandemic. The Spanish flu was a pandemic. This is not to be taken lightly, people. This is serious. Now, I'll finish out the article. Asked whether she still treats Nibiru patients, she made a startling confession. I had to stop seeing them. It was getting too much for me to handle. I started thinking about Nibiru too much myself. I was having visions. I caught myself just in time. Wow. Man, I have never had a vision of Nibiru. Don't know what that means, but I mean, if, clinical psychologists and psychiatrists are having visions just by being exposed to the word. This is a highly contagious disease. While Dr. Wallace makes valid arguments, her conclusions are questionable. Really? She fails to account for scientific evidence that proves Nibiru's reality. Photographs taken from the Hubble and South Pole telescopes, testimony from authenticated whistleblowers, and notable science that have mysteriously disappeared. One thing is certain, the debate over Nibiru's existence has persisted for over 30 years and shows no signs of ending anytime soon. Now, I don't know if this is satire. I don't know if this is in fact real. What I do know is that when we begin to see articles like this, and you begin to see doctors who are making these statements that being exposed to the word Nibiru, I don't agree with that. Listen, science is an argument of contradictions. It just depends on which contradiction wins the argument that becomes the flavor of the day. And where psychology is concerned, I'll just say Freud and I'll leave it there. But the fact that this doctor has taken the time, and I would suspect that there's probably a white paper coming behind this. This is disturbing, folks. You don't understand that if a person, a doctor, petitions the CDC, and if the CDC, let's just say wildly, does in fact list the Nibiru syndrome, let's just say it's the syndrome, as a health hazard, public health hazard, this could lead to some very interesting consequences. So I put this out there, put it out there for your consumption. I'll leave the link. You're certainly more than happy to comment on it. Comment on this site here. But I did want to bring it to you. And let's see what the comments come like. All right. Be kind and keep your perspective.